The first thing I saw was my husband's shoe. Brown leather, polished bright enough to catch the kitchen light, less than a foot from my face. I was 33 years old, crouched under my father's walnut kitchen table with my knees pressed against my chest, holding my breath so hard my ribs hurt, while the man I had slept beside for 12 years leaned over that table and told my 64-year-old father that signing away his paid-off house was just paperwork. 3 minutes earlier, Dad had dragged me inside without saying hello, kicked the front door shut behind me, gripped my shoulders and whispered, "Under the kitchen table. Now, don't make a sound." I thought something was wrong with him. I thought maybe the confusion my husband had been warning me about had finally gotten worse. I thought my father was afraid because he was old, alone, and losing his grip on the world. Then the doorbell rang. Dad opened the door. Calvin walked in. And from the dark space beneath the table where I had once hidden as a child during thunderstorms, I heard my husband say, "Nolan, this house is too much for you now. Let me handle the deed. Mara doesn't need to know every detail yet. It's just paperwork." That was the moment my marriage did not end with shouting or tears or another woman's lipstick on a collar. It ended with floor wax on my sleeve, my father's boot pressed against my wrist to keep me from moving, and an old AM/FM radio on the kitchen counter, recording every word Calvin thought no one would ever hear. My name is Mara Ellison, and before that night I believed two things with absolute certainty. I believed my father was becoming forgetful, and I believed my husband was trying to protect him. Those two beliefs were the walls Calvin built around me, one careful sentence at a time. He never said, "Your father is useless now." He said, "Nolan seems tired." He never said, "I want the house." He said, "Estate planning prevents family pain." He never said, "Your father is easy to manipulate." He said, "Men like him don't admit when they need help." That was Calvin's gift. He could wrap theft and concern so neatly that you felt cruel for questioning the ribbon. For months before the night under the table, he had been telling me my father was slipping. He said Dad repeated questions. He said Dad misplaced bills. He said Dad had asked where my mother kept the Christmas candles, even though my mother had been dead 14 years. And because grief makes certain fears believable, I believed him more than I should have. I was a senior accounting manager for a department store chain in White Plains. I could find a missing $2 in a vendor ledger spread across 18 stores, but I had missed 12 years of missing truth in my own marriage. Dad's house was not grand. 3 bedrooms, tired siding, a narrow porch, a garage that smelled like motor oil, cracked linoleum in the kitchen, and a bathroom sink that would only stop dripping if you turned the handle at exactly the angle Dad insisted was perfectly obvious. But that house was the one clean victory my father had won from life. He bought it in 1987 when he was 26, newly married to my mother, Evelyn, and working 60-hour weeks as an auto mechanic. He paid that mortgage through layoffs, medical bills, winter repairs, my mother's chemo, and every ordinary emergency that makes poor and middle-class people choose which crisis gets paid first. We did not take vacations. We took Sunday drives. We did not replace appliances when they aged. Dad opened them up, cursed at them, and made them work another year. When Mom got sick, he sold his fishing boat but never missed a payment. When I was 28, he unfolded the paid-off deed at this same walnut table and let me hold it. The paper had softened at the creases from being opened and refolded so many times. He tapped it with one thick finger and said, "This means nobody can tell me to leave." I laughed then. I said nobody would ever try. 5 years later, under that table, my husband was trying. The table itself had been in the house almost as long as my mother's voice. Dad bought it at an estate sale in 1998 because he said real furniture should be heavier than the people arguing around it. It was too big for the kitchen, too dark for the room, and too scratched to be called nice by anyone who cared about nice things. But Mom loved it. She said a table like that made people sit down and tell the truth. When I was little, I hid under it during storms with a blanket over my head while Dad listened to Yankees games on the old cream-colored AM/FM radio beside the coffee maker. That radio had a cracked antenna, a yellow dial, and one knob that came off if you pulled too hard. Calvin hated it from the first year he came around. "You know they make phones now, Nolan," he once said with a laugh, tapping the top of it like it was a fossil. Dad just looked at him and said, "Phones don't sound like summer." I thought it was a harmless old man answer. I did not know that years later, the thing Calvin dismissed as junk would be the only witness in the room he never thought to threaten. I met Calvin Rusk when I was 21 at a Christmas fundraiser in a downtown hotel ballroom. I remember the green dress I wore because it was my mother's, and I remember the exact time he walked up because I had been checking my watch every 3 minutes, trying to decide how soon I could leave without insulting my supervisor. Calvin appeared beside the punch table with a bourbon glass and an easy smile and said, "You look like you're calculating your escape route." It was exactly the right thing to say to a young accountant who hated parties. I laughed. He asked about my job without making it sound boring. He asked about my father without making it sound like small talk. He asked whether I had grown up in White Plains, whether my parents still lived nearby, whether I had siblings. At the time, I thought he was interested in me. Later, I found out he had been interested in my answers. He was 33, a used car sales manager with a salesman's patience and a predator's sense of timing. He did not rush. He watched. He listened. He made me feel chosen. That was the first thing he stole from me, the belief that I had been the one choosing. For the first few years, Calvin looked like the husband every father hopes his daughter finds. He showed up on time. He brought coffee to my office during tax season. He warmed my car on cold mornings. He visited Dad after work with beer and offers to fix little things around the house. He remembered the anniversary of my mother's death and once left flowers at her grave before I did. I thought that meant love. Dad was polite with him, but never fully relaxed. I used to blame Dad's old grief for that. Calvin would come home from Dad's house smelling faintly of garage dust and say, "Your father's stubborn, but I think he likes me." I wanted that to be true so badly that I helped make it true in my mind. I ignored the way Dad went quiet after some of Calvin's visits. I ignored the way Calvin seemed to know exactly where Dad kept things. I ignored the little questions Calvin asked at dinner. Did Dad have a mortgage left? Was the deed in his name only? Had Mom left a will? Did Dad have a lawyer? Calvin never asked them all at once. He scattered them across years like crumbs. The first hard proof that Calvin had not stumbled into my life came after the hearing, but I need to tell you about it now because it changed every memory I had of him. In a banker's box we found behind winter tires in our garage, there was a folded county tax printout dated 3 weeks before the Christmas fundraiser where I met him. It showed my father's address, parcel number, assessed value, and the words "mortgage satisfied" circled in blue ink. Beside the address in Calvin's handwriting were 4 notes: widower, 1 daughter, no siblings, mechanic. Under that one word, safe, not pretty, not rich, not interesting, safe. I stared at that paper for so long June Talcott, my coworker, had to take it out of my hands. The man I thought had noticed me by the punch bowl had actually noticed my father's house first. He did not marry me and later become greedy. He married the route to a paid-off property and waited 12 years for the gate to open. His first open attempt to discuss the house came disguised as tax concern. We were eating dinner at our own kitchen table when he said, almost casually, "Your dad's property taxes are probably higher than they need to be." I looked up because taxes were my language and vague statements about them bothered me. "Why?" Calvin twirled pasta around his fork and shrugged. "Paid-off house, single owner, older man. There are ways to structure things better. If your name were on the property, or ours, we could make sure it doesn't get swallowed by probate later." "My father's house is his," I said. Calvin smiled gently as if I had turned kindness into conflict. "Of course it is. I'm talking about protecting him." That became his favorite verb: protecting, planning, simplifying, helping. Calvin understood that Americans will sign away frightening things if you present them as paperwork that prevents future inconvenience. He did not say, "Let me take your father's house." He said, "A man who worked that hard deserves peace." Meanwhile, he was training my father to sign. That is what we later realized. Not deeds at first, nothing dramatic. Utility contact forms, insurance verification, a neighborhood association notice. A pension document Dad did not need, but Calvin said should be updated for safety. He stood beside Dad at the walnut table, pointed to signature lines, and said, "Use your full legal name, Nolan. It keeps everything clean." A few months after those little forms started, small withdrawals appeared from Dad's accounts. $180, $240, $300, not enough to trigger alarm, enough to test access. Whenever Dad questioned it, Calvin had an explanation. Maybe Dad took out cash for parts. Maybe he forgot helping someone from the old shop. Maybe aging was showing up in small ways. "Don't embarrass him," Calvin told me once. Proud men would rather be robbed than admit they forgot. I hated that sentence, not because it sounded false, but because it sounded possible. The first person to make me look at the pattern clearly was June Talcott, a junior accountant on my team. June was 27, blunt and impossible to impress. She had a way of tapping a pen against her teeth when numbers smelled wrong. One afternoon, she saw me reviewing Dad's bank statements during lunch and said, "Why do Tuesdays keep bleeding?" I looked up. "What?" She leaned closer and pointed. "Small cash withdrawals, different channels, same rhythm. Tuesday, Tuesday, Tuesday." "That's not an old man forgetting, that's a schedule." I stared at the sheet. She was right. The amounts varied, but the days clustered. Tuesdays, Calvin's regular day to check on Dad. I defended him automatically. "He takes Dad places sometimes." June gave me a look only accountants can give, the look that says feelings are not a reconciliation method. Then ask for receipts, she said. I did. Calvin laughed, not cruelly, worse, patiently. Mara, your father is old school. He uses cash. Don't turn him into an audit. I apologized to him that night. I still remember that. I apologized for noticing. Then came the half-burned envelope. I found it in our outside trash under coffee grounds and paper towels after Calvin had gone to bed. It was a private lender notice addressed to Calvin at the dealership, warning of default on a note secured by inventory that, according to the numbers listed, should have been impossible. Amount due $38,600. When I asked him about it, he looked wounded. That was before, he said, before us. I was embarrassed. It's dated last week. His face changed for less than a second before he recovered. They resend old things. You know how finance offices are. I did know. That was why the lie bothered me. Finance offices resend statements, yes. They do not threaten legal action on dead accounts with current dates unless something is alive and unpaid. After that night, I stopped asking Calvin questions out loud. I started saving copies. Dad's performance began around the same time. I did not know it was performance then. To me, it looked like the beginning of the thing I feared most. He paused longer on phone calls. He asked me twice what day it was. Once, in a voice that made my stomach drop, he asked whether Mom had put the Christmas candles upstairs or in the hall closet. My mother, Evelyn, had been dead 14 years. I called Calvin in tears. He answered too calmly. He did that with me too, he said. I didn't want to scare you. Why didn't you tell me? Because you're emotional about him, Mara. I'm trying to handle it gently. There it was again, Calvin as the calm one, Calvin as the protector, Calvin as the man standing between me and pain. 2 days later, I went to Dad's house and found him in the garage sorting sockets by size. He did not look confused. He looked tired and watchful. Did you ask about Mom? I said. He turned a socket between his fingers and asked, Did Calvin tell you that? Dad, he set the socket down. Mara, if a man needs you to believe I'm slipping, ask yourself what he wants me too weak to stop. It was the first direct warning he gave me. I wanted more, but Dad glanced toward the kitchen window and lowered his voice. Not here. By then, Dad had already spoken to Arlen Voss. Arlen was an old friend from high school, retired from the local police department after a knee injury, and now installed security cameras for small businesses that did not trust national companies. He had the stillness of a man who had spent decades waiting for other people to say too much. Dad showed him the strange forms, the small withdrawals, the LLC name he had memorized from a deed draft Calvin snatched back too quickly, and the spiral notebooks from Harlan Tuck across the street. Harlan was a retired postal route supervisor who wrote everything down because 40 years of tracking mail had made unrecorded movement feel wrong to him. Calvin's sedan, Tuesdays at 2:47 p.m., leaving around 4:15, again and again. At first, Harlan thought he was just being nosy. Arlen looked at the notebooks and said, no, he was being useful. But Arlen also told Dad something that nearly broke him. You don't have enough yet. You have smoke. You need him to carry the fire into the room. That was when the old radio became more than a radio. Arlen hid a recorder inside the cream-colored AM/FM set on Dad's counter, behind the cracked dial Calvin had mocked for years. Dad tested it during a Yankees game. Static, announcer, crowd noise, and then Dad saying, testing, testing, Calvin's a snake. Arlen told him not to joke on evidence equipment. Dad told him not to call a radio equipment. For 2 weeks, the recorder sat there while Calvin came and went, assuming old things were harmless because he had always assumed old people were harmless if you spoke slowly enough. Dad acted more confused. He let Calvin see a bill with the wrong year circled. He asked Calvin where the spare house key was, though he had changed its hiding place years earlier. He repeated the same question about a gutter estimate 3 times until Calvin's patience warmed into confidence. Then Dad gave him the fake failure, a signature. Calvin brought a document and said it was only a preliminary acknowledgement for future planning. Dad took the pen with a shaking hand and wrote null before stopping, just 3 letters. Calvin leaned over him, almost breathing on his shoulder, and said, That's okay. We'll finish it when you feel steadier. Dad told me later that was the moment he knew Calvin believed the house was already halfway gone. The night everything happened, Dad called me at 5:18 p.m. and asked about Mom's Christmas candles. I froze in the middle of my apartment kitchen, one hand on the counter, Calvin's coffee mug still in the sink from that morning. Dad, I said, silence, then so faint I almost missed it. He whispered, Not now. The line went dead. I called back, no answer. I called Calvin. He answered after 2 rings. Your dad's okay, he said before I asked. I stopped by earlier. He's just tired. He asked about Mom, Calvin sighed, and I could almost see him rubbing his forehead, performing burden. Mara, I didn't want you to hear him like that, but yes, it's getting worse. We need to move quickly before he signs something with the wrong person. The wrong person, that phrase lodged in me. I told Calvin I had work to finish. Instead, I drove to Dad's house without calling. That is how I ended up under the walnut table at 9:53 p.m., listening to the man I married ask my father to transfer the deed. Calvin sat above me, drinking coffee from the mug with the blue chip on the rim, speaking in that warm, polished voice that had once made strangers trust him with car loans. Nolan, he said, you know I love Mara. Everything I'm doing is to protect her. Dad did not answer. Calvin continued. If this house goes through probate, she'll be buried in filings. Fees, creditors, taxes, you don't want that. You worked too hard. I did, Dad said. Exactly, so let me make sure your work doesn't get wasted. Papers slid across the table. I saw their edges from below, white and clean and deadly. This version is simpler, Calvin said. No LLC language to confuse things. Dad's boot shifted. Mara's name on it. Calvin paused. Eventually, that's not what I asked. Calvin exhaled softly, like Dad was making this harder than it needed to be. Mara is my wife. What protects me protects her. My hand curled around the table leg. Dad's boot pressed lightly against my wrist. Wait. Then Calvin stood to warm Dad's coffee. From under the table, through the narrow gap between chair legs, I saw him move to the counter. His back was turned, but the kitchen light caught his hand as it went into his jacket. He pulled out a small amber bottle, twisted the cap, shook pale powder into Dad's mug, and stirred it so gently the spoon barely clicked. My body tried to move. Dad's boot pressed harder. Do not. Calvin returned and placed the mug near Dad's hand. Drink. You look shaky. Dad wrapped both hands around the cup but did not lift it. His voice came out thin, uncertain, perfect. My hands are too bad tonight. Read me the important part first. Calvin's patience cracked just enough for the recorder to hear the real man underneath. We've been through this. Read it. Nolan, the paper says you're transferring your interests so the property can be managed responsibly. By you, by family. Mara, no. Mara doesn't need to know every detail before it's done. What if I forget signing? Calvin leaned forward. I felt the table take his weight. Then you forget. People forget things. That's why paperwork matters more than memory. Paperwork matters more than memory. If Calvin had stopped there, it would have been enough to kill the last living part of my trust. But he kept going because men like him talk when they think they are winning. Dad let silence pull more out of him. I have people waiting on this, Calvin said. I told them I could secure collateral by Friday. Collateral? Dad asked. Don't get hung up on words. My house is a word. Calvin's voice hardened. Your house is sitting there while I'm trying to keep everything from falling apart. The dealership is under review. The lender wants security. If I can show family equity, I can breathe. With my house, with our future. Mara's future, Calvin laughed once. Mara sees numbers and thinks that means she understands pressure. She doesn't. She balances invoices for coat racks and perfume counters. I'm dealing with real money. That sentence cut through me in a place I had not known was still soft. He had spent years praising my mind in public and belittling it in private to an old man he thought he controlled. Dad asked, and if I don't sign? Calvin went quiet for several seconds. When he spoke again, there was no warmth left. Then I explained to Mara why you're not safe making decisions. I have dates, conversations, the thing about Evelyn. I don't want to do that to you. I'm trying to give you dignity. Dad's hand left the mug. His voice changed, not louder, clearer. By drugging my coffee, the kitchen went still. Calvin said, What? Dad pushed the mug away. You put something in it. You're confused. No, Dad said. I'm a mechanic. I notice when a man puts additives where they don't belong. That was my cue, though no one had given it to me. I came out from under the table awkwardly, my knee hitting the floor, my elbow scraping the waxed linoleum, dust in my hair, rage so cold in my chest it felt almost calm. Calvin turned. For the first time in 12 years, his face had no ready expression. No wounded husband, no patient son-in-law, no kind protector. Just surprised, naked and ugly. Mara, he said. I looked at the mug, the papers, the old radio, then at him. You just tried to drug my father in the house he paid for. Calvin recovered fast, but not completely. This is insane, he said. Nolan, what did you do? Hide her here. Do you understand how unstable this looks? Dad reached to the radio and turned the volume knob slightly. Static rose from the speaker, then Arlen Voss's voice came through from the receiver outside. Nolan, don't touch the cup. Mara, put the papers in the plastic sleeve on the counter. I'm coming in. Calvin stared at the old radio. I watched him understand. All those years of laughing at that cracked plastic box, all those years of thinking old things were useless if they did not impress him. Dad looked at him and said, You always did talk too much when you thought you were smarter than the room. Calvin whispered, You recorded me. Dad shook his head. No, you recorded yourself. I did not scream. That surprises people when I tell them. They expect that moment to be loud. It was not. It was procedural. Arlen entered through the back door with gloves and evidence bags. He was retired, so he did not play television cop. He controlled the room, called a uniformed officer he trusted, photographed the mug and papers, and told me not to touch anything with bare hands. Calvin kept saying it was a family misunderstanding. Then he said Dad had set him up. Then he said I was emotional. Then he said the bottle was antacid. Arlen bagged it without arguing. Later, testing showed a sedative, not enough to kill Dad, enough to make him slow, pliable, easy to describe as confused. Calvin looked at me in the doorway before he left and said, "You're making the biggest mistake of your life." I answered quietly, "No, Calvin, I made it 12 years ago. Tonight I stopped making it." At 1:12 a.m., I sat beside my father in an urgent care waiting room while rain streaked the windows and an infomercial played silently on a mounted television. He held a paper cup of water in both hands. Without the performance, he looked exhausted. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked. He kept his eyes on the vending machine. "Would you have believed me?" I wanted to say yes, but the truth had already done enough damage without me lying to decorate it. "I don't know," he nodded. That's why it hurt, because it was fair. Marriage had trained me to ask for Calvin's side. Love had trained me to soften facts before they accused him. Dad had known that if he told me, I might argue. If he showed me numbers, I might ask for context. If he gave me context, I might warn my husband. So he gave me Calvin's own voice instead. After blood work, after statements, after Arlen drove Dad home and checked every window, I went to June Talcott's apartment instead of my own house. She opened the door at 3:04 a.m. in sweatpants and a sweatshirt that said "Audit first, cry later." She looked at my face and stepped aside. We worked until sunrise. Dad's withdrawals, Calvin's lender notice, the LLC registration, Harlan's notebook scans, the deed drafts, screenshots of Calvin warning me about Dad's confusion. By 6:20, June had built a timeline across her dining table. "You need a lawyer today," she said, "not tomorrow." By 7:45, I stood outside the family court filing window in the same coat I had worn under the kitchen table. There was still floor wax on my sleeve. I left it there. Forms are cruel because they make catastrophe fit inside boxes. Date of marriage, shared accounts, property, threats, recent incidents. You write attempted coercion of elderly parent regarding deed transfer, and it looks almost tidy. You write suspected sedative placed in drink, and the clerk's eyes lift for half a second before training lowers them again. My attorney, Lydia Shore, arrived at the courthouse after June called a cousin who knew someone who knew someone. Lydia was small, sharp, and had the expression of a woman who considered panic inefficient. She listened to the audio through earbuds, read the timeline, looked at the property printout Calvin had circled years before, and said, "Do not call him. Do not go home alone. Do not warn him what we have. You are not here to win an argument. You are here to stop access." That became the sentence I lived by. Stop access. We requested emergency restrictions on joint accounts. We notified the county recorder of suspected deed fraud and placed an alert on Dad's parcel. We filed to prevent Calvin from contacting Dad. We sent preservation notices to the dealership. By noon, Calvin's card declined at a gas station, and my phone began lighting up like a house on fire. He called 47 times the first day. He texted as a husband, then a victim, then a threat. "We need to talk. Your father manipulated you. You are stealing marital funds. You don't understand what I was trying to prevent. Call me before lawyers make this ugly." Then at 4:16 p.m., between two threats about court, he wrote, "I still love you." I sat on the courthouse steps and stared at that one until the letters blurred. People think truth turns love off. It does not right away. Your body remembers the man who warmed your car before your mind can fully process the man who drugged your father's coffee. I wanted clean hatred. I did not get it. What I got was instruction. Do not answer. Do not go home alone. Stop access. So I followed instruction until strength caught up. The case widened in pieces. Harlan Tuck brought over 3 spiral notebooks in a grocery bag, each page dated, each entry written in narrow postal route handwriting. Calvin's car arriving at 2:47. Calvin leaving with envelopes. Calvin coming on days I worked late. Didn't know what it meant, Harlan said, standing in Dad's kitchen with his cap in his hands. But if something happens the same way enough times, it's either a schedule or a scheme. June found that the Tuesday withdrawals matched those visits. Lydia found the dealership loans. Kendra Solis, the woman from Calvin's old small claims case, came forward and explained how he had taken $14,000 from her for a fake dealership expansion, always promising that paperwork was coming. Paperwork, Calvin's favorite ghost, always coming, never clear, always standing between the victim and the theft until it was too late. The preliminary hearing was where just paperwork finally turned on him. Calvin arrived in a navy suit I had bought him for our 10th anniversary. His attorney stood and told the judge this was a bitter wife weaponizing a family misunderstanding. He said my father was confused. He said Calvin had been trying to protect future inheritance. Then he said the sentence Lydia had been waiting for. At the center of this entire dispute is, frankly, just paperwork. Lydia did not move right away. She let the words sit in the room, then she asked permission to play the recording. Calvin's voice filled the courtroom, smooth and familiar and dead. It's just paperwork. Then another clip. Mara doesn't need to know every detail before it's done. Then another. If you forget signing, then you forget. People forget things. That's why paperwork matters more than memory. The room changed, not loudly. The air simply stopped belonging to Calvin. The witnesses did not tell one grand story. Each told only the piece they had touched. Harlan confirmed dates and visits. June explained the Tuesday withdrawal pattern. Kendra described the earlier investment lie. Arlen explained the recorder, the mug, and the bottle. Dad spoke last. He wore the gray jacket my mother had chosen years ago, and his hands shook until he stated his full name. Nolan Patrick Ellison. After that, his voice steadied. Lydia asked what he believed Calvin had been trying to do. Dad looked at the judge, not at my husband. He kept calling it paperwork, he said, but paperwork is what people use when they want theft to look polite. I heard someone behind us exhale. Calvin looked down at the table. Real life did not give us one perfect ending that afternoon. There were continuances, filings, forensic reviews, amended complaints, and months of signatures that made me hate pens, but the direction changed. Calvin lost access to joint funds except through monitored channels. Dad's title alert became permanent. The dealership suspended Calvin, then terminated him when the inventory loans surfaced. The lender he owed money to filed separately. Kendra reopened her civil claim. Calvin's mother, Marla, became part of another review after Lydia connected her name to an old title transfer from before our marriage. Calvin was not dragged away screaming. That would have been simpler. He unraveled the ordinary way, accounts frozen, calls unanswered, reputation collapsing one returned document at a time. I went back to the house Calvin and I had shared only once before the divorce was final. I went with June, a locksmith, and a police standby Lydia arranged. It is a strange thing to walk through your own bedroom like a crime scene. His shirt still hung in the closet. My lotion sat by the sink. A grocery list in his handwriting lay on the counter. Eggs, filters, coffee, antacid. I stood staring at that last word until June quietly took the paper and put it in a folder. In the garage, behind winter tires, we found the banker's box. Copies of Dad's utility bills, photographs of Dad's driver's license, old signatures clipped from forms, 3 deed drafts with different receiving entities. One had my name, 2 did not. The drafts hurt more than the recording in a colder way. The recording showed impulse. The drafts showed revision. Calvin had sat somewhere and decided, more than once, how much of me to include in stealing my father's life. His answer kept getting smaller. Dad stayed with me for 6 weeks after the hearing, though he insisted on calling it staying over, like he had brought one change of clothes and not half his garage habits. We fought about stupid things because the big thing was too large to touch every day. He hated my coffee. I hated the way he tried to fix my dishwasher at midnight. He folded towels like shop rags. I accused him of making me feel crazy by pretending to decline. He accused me of hiding behind a marriage so long he had to build a trap to get my attention. We both apologized badly. One night, while rain tapped my apartment windows, he said, "I'm sorry I made you crawl under that table." I shook my head. "I'm not." He looked at me. "If you had told me, I would have asked for proof. If you had shown me proof, I would have asked for context. If you gave me context, I would have asked him to explain." Dad nodded once, tears in his eyes that he refused to let fall. "That's why I needed you to hear the explanation first." The divorce became final 11 months after the night under the table. Calvin pleaded to lesser charges connected to financial fraud and attempted coercion, with the sedative incident folded into the broader case because what you know in your bones and what the court can prove cleanly are not always the same shape. He lost his job, his financing credentials, most of his credit, and every claim he tried to make against Dad's property. He was ordered to repay money, though collecting it became its own slow machine. Last I heard, he was working at a salvage yard outside Yonkers, moving parts instead of selling cars. I did not feel joy when I heard that. I felt the absence of fear. Sometimes that is better. Dad's house stayed his. That was the victory. Not dramatic, not cinematic. Just a man sitting at his own kitchen table without anyone waiting for his hand to shake over a signature line. Lydia helped us set up real protections, title alerts, specific medical directives, narrow power of attorney language, account notifications, and a real estate attorney Dad disliked because the man's shoes were too shiny, but respected because every page said exactly what it meant. Arlen removed the recorder from the old radio and handed the empty shell back to Dad. "It can just be a radio again," he said. Dad ran his thumb over the cracked dial. "Good," he said. "Thing always had enough to say." A year after that night, Dad invited me over for dinner. He made pot roast too dry, mashed potatoes too salty, and green beans cooked the way my mother used to cook them, which meant far beyond forgiveness. We ate at the walnut kitchen table. For the first time I sat in Calvin's old chair. I thought it would feel haunted. It did not. It felt like a chair, scarred, heavy, still standing. The AM/FM radio played a Yankees pregame show through static. No recorder. No hidden purpose. Just sound. After dinner, Dad opened the hallway drawer and took out the paid-off deed, now sealed in a protective sleeve with the title alert clipped behind it. He looked embarrassed, as if showing love through documents was still too emotional. "Lydia says this is right now," he said. I smiled. "Lydia never says anything is right. She says it's properly restricted." Dad laughed, a small, rusty sound that filled the kitchen. Before I left, I crouched beside the table, not under it, just beside it, and rubbed at a pale mark on one carved leg. Dad watched me. "What are you doing? There's still floor wax here," I said. "From my coat, maybe." He leaned down as far as his back allowed. "Leave it." "Why?" He shrugged. "Proof you came out." I looked up at him, and for a second I was 33 and 8 years old at the same time, under that table during a storm, beside it after a war, listening to the same old radio fight through static. I started crying so suddenly I had to sit back in the chair. Dad put one hand on my shoulder, awkward and steady. We stayed that way while the refrigerator hummed, the announcer talked baseball, and the house did what houses are supposed to do when nobody is trying to steal them. It held. The last letter Calvin sent came through his attorney because every other door was closed. He wrote that someday I would understand the pressure he had been under. He wrote that he had loved me in his own way. He wrote that my father had turned me against him. Then he wrote it was never about the house. I almost admired the nerve it took to put that sentence on paper. I did not answer. Instead, I drove to Dad's, made coffee in the repaired machine, and sat at the walnut table while he complained about a relief pitcher as if the world had narrowed back to ordinary disappointments. When I left, he walked me to the porch. "You lock your doors?" he asked. "Always. Check your oil. Last week. You eating?" "Yes, Dad." He nodded, satisfied. Then he said, quieter, "You sitting at your own table now?" I knew what he meant. Not furniture. Life. Whether I was still hiding under someone else's version of the truth, I looked back through the open doorway at the kitchen, at the radio, at the table, at the drawer where the deed rested under proper lock and proper law. "Yes," I said, "I am." Coming out from under a table is not one moment. It is the first second of a long recovery. After that, you still have to file papers, change locks, freeze accounts, disappoint people who liked you better when you were easy to fool, and grieve the person you thought you married. You still have to learn that a calm voice is not the same as a safe hand. You still have to stop apologizing for facts just because they hurt someone who lied. My husband told my father it was just paperwork. He was wrong. Paperwork can steal a house. Paperwork can freeze an account. Paperwork can end a marriage. Paperwork can protect an old man who spent 30 years earning the right not to be moved. And sometimes, if the right person hides the right recorder inside an old radio no one respects, paperwork can give the truth a place to sit down and finally be heard.